The Breakers stands on a cliff above the Atlantic, 70 rooms, 138,000 square feet of marble and gilt and imported stone. The walls of the Great Hall are Caen limestone, cut from quarries in Normandy. The floors gleam with marble shipped from Italy and Africa. An entire music room was designed and built in Paris, then disassembled, crated, loaded onto ships, and reassembled by French craftsmen who crossed an ocean to install a single chamber in what its owners called a summer cottage. This is Newport, Rhode Island. This is the Gilded Age, preserved in stone and silence. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built this palace for his wife Alice and their 7 children between 1893 and 1895. The construction cost exceeded $7 million, a sum that staggers even now. Today, 400,000 visitors walk through its gilded halls each year, searching for something glamour, perhaps, or history, or simply a window into a world that vanished long ago. In the library, a 16th century fireplace imported from a chateau in Burgundy bears an inscription carved centuries before the Vanderbilts existed. The words read, "I laugh at great wealth and never miss it. Nothing but wisdom matters in the end." The irony would take 4 generations to unfold. Gloria Laura Vanderbilt was born on February 20th, 1924, great-great-granddaughter of the Commodore who amassed the fortune, granddaughter of the man who built this house. She would inherit millions before she could walk. She would be fought over in a custody trial that transfixed Depression-era America. She would marry 4 times, bury a husband and a son, build and lose a fashion empire, and die at 95 years old with a fraction of the wealth she was born into. The poor little rich girl. The newspapers gave her that phrase when she was 10 years old. She spent the rest of her life trying to escape it. This is her story. Chapter 1. $100 million. On January 4th, 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt died in his bedroom at No. 10 Washington Place in Manhattan. He was 82 years old. His fortune was valued at $105 million, a sum larger than the United States Treasury held at that moment. In modern terms, that figure approaches $3 billion. He was the richest man in America, and arguably the richest man who had ever lived on the continent. He had started with $100, borrowed from his mother at 16 to buy a small sailing vessel called the Swiftsure. He ferried passengers across New York Harbor for 18 cents a ride. He undercut his competitors ruthlessly. He bought more boats. By his 30s, he dominated the steamship trade along the eastern seaboard and had earned his nickname the Commodore, a title he never held officially but wore like armor. By his 50s, he had turned to railroads. The New York and Harlem Line, the Hudson River Railroad, the New York Central. He consolidated routes, eliminated redundancies, slashed costs, and destroyed anyone who resisted. When competitors tried to outmaneuver him, he sent a famous letter, "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I'll ruin you." His will revealed his character as clearly as his business dealings. $95 million, 90% of everything he possessed, went to his eldest son, William Henry. His 8 daughters received $500,000 each, less than 1% of the estate, divided among 8 women. His second wife, Frank, received the same. The Commodore believed that fortune should remain concentrated in male hands, that women were incapable of managing serious wealth, and that sentiment had no place in matters of succession. He left explicit instructions for how to preserve what he had built. His heirs would ignore nearly all of them. William Henry proved a competent steward, perhaps the only one the family would produce. He expanded the railroad holdings, negotiated favorable government contracts, and doubled the fortune to more than $200 million within 8 years. When he died suddenly in 1885, he left behind the largest estate ever recorded in American history. His sons inherited the responsibility of maintaining it. They chose instead to spend it. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, eldest grandson of the Commodore, commissioned the renowned architect Richard Morris Hunt to design a summer residence in Newport, Rhode Island. The result was the Breakers' 70 rooms on a cliff above the Atlantic, constructed between 1893 and 1895 at a cost exceeding $7 million. The Great Hall rose 45 feet, its walls faced with Caen limestone from Normandy. The dining room seated 34 guests beneath a ceiling, painted to resemble a windswept sky. Bathtubs were carved from single blocks of Italian marble. And then there was the music room. The entire chamber was designed in France by the Parisian firm Jules Allard and Sons. French craftsmen constructed it piece by piece in workshops along the Seine. Every gilded panel, every painted ceiling tile, every carved molding. When complete, they disassembled the entire room, packed it into wooden crates, loaded those crates onto ships, sailed them across the Atlantic, transported them by rail to Rhode Island, and reassembled the chamber inside the breakers. The artisans who built it traveled with it, crossing an ocean to install a single room in what the Vanderbilts called a summer cottage. This was the world the family built. This was the scale of the ambition, the excess, the almost unfathomable confidence that more would always be more. Cornelius II's brother George constructed Biltmore in the mountains of North Carolina, 250 rooms, the largest private home in America. Another brother, William Kissam, built Marble House down the street from the breakers. The Vanderbilt name appeared on mansions along Fifth Avenue, on racing yachts in Newport Harbor, on private rail cars that crossed the continent in mahogany splendor. But fortunes require vigilant management, and the third generation preferred leisure. The railroads faced mounting competition from automobiles and airplanes. The mansions demanded armies of servants, coal by the hundreds of tons, maintenance that never ceased. Money flowed out faster than it flowed in, and no one seemed to notice. Among the sons of Cornelius II was a young man named Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt. He inherited $10 million upon his father's death. He loved horses, gambling, and alcohol, perhaps in that order, perhaps in reverse. He founded several equestrian clubs. He frequented racetracks. He married twice. He spent lavishly and saved nothing. He would be Gloria's father, and he would be dead before she turned 2 years old. Chapter 2: Sandy Point Farm. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt was born on January 14, 1880, the youngest son of Cornelius II, the baby of a sprawling family that measured love in ledger books and legacies. He inherited $10 million upon coming of age, the equivalent of nearly 180 million in today's currency. It should have been enough to last several lifetimes. It barely lasted one. He loved horses above all else. He bred them, raced them, studied their bloodlines, and built his entire life around them. Sandy Point Farm, his 280-acre estate in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, became his sanctuary, a colonial revival manor house surrounded by stables, paddocks, and all the paraphernalia of a gentleman equestrian. He founded riding clubs and sponsored competitions. He kept meticulous breeding records. The horses, at least, he cared for properly. Everything else suffered from neglect. His first marriage, to Kathleen Nielsen in 1903, produced one daughter also named Kathleen before ending in divorce in 1920. His finances bled steadily from gambling losses, lavish entertaining, and a fundamental inability to distinguish between capital and income. And, always, relentlessly, there was the drinking, brandy milk punches in the morning, cocktails through the afternoon, wine with dinner and whiskey after. His liver was failing by his early 40s, though he either did not know or did not care. On March 6, 1923, Reginald Vanderbilt married for the second time. His bride was Gloria Morgan, one of twin sisters renowned in society circles for their beauty. She was 18 years old, though she claimed to be 21. He was 43. The age gap was significant. The difference in circumstances was greater still. Gloria Morgan came from a family of modest means and considerable ambition. Her father was a diplomat of minor rank. Her mother had raised the twins to understand that beauty was currency, and that currency was meant to be spent wisely. Marrying a Vanderbilt, even a dissipated one, was the wisest investment Gloria Morgan ever made. The wedding took place in Manhattan, a society affair covered by the newspapers. The bride was radiant. The groom was drunk, or nearly so, as had become his custom. If Gloria Morgan understood what she was marrying into the alcoholism, the debt, the slow-motion collapse of a man who had inherited everything and built nothing, she gave no sign. She had secured the Vanderbilt name. That was enough. 11 months later, on February 20th, 1924, Gloria Laura Vanderbilt was born in Manhattan. Reginald reportedly held his daughter and exclaimed, "It is fantastic how Vanderbilt she looks. See the corners of her eyes, how they turn up." It was one of the few recorded moments of affection between father and child. There would not be many others. For the next 18 months, little Gloria lived in the orbit of two parents who barely intersected with her world. Her mother preferred parties to nurseries. Her father preferred horses to children and whiskey to horses. A nurse named Emma Sullivan Kieslich, whom Gloria would come to call Dodo, became the infant's primary caretaker, feeding her, bathing her, rocking her to sleep. Dodo was Irish, patient, and utterly devoted. She would matter more to Gloria than either parent ever did. On September 4th, 1925, Reginald Vanderbilt died at Sandy Point Farm. He was 45 years old. The official cause was cirrhosis of the liver, the predictable conclusion to decades of relentless drinking. He died surrounded by the horses he had loved, in the house he had built for them, leaving behind a young widow, a toddler daughter, and debts that consumed much of what remained of his fortune. The estate, once finally settled, revealed the full extent of the damage. Reginald had burned through most of his $10 million inheritance. What remained was a $5 million trust fund, established years earlier by wiser hands, to be split between his two daughters, Kathleen from his first marriage, and little Gloria from his second. Gloria's share came to approximately $2.5 million, a substantial sum, worth perhaps $45 million today, but a mere fraction of what the Vanderbilt family had once commanded. There was a complication. Gloria was 18 months old. She could not control her own inheritance. That responsibility fell to her mother, the same Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, who had never managed money because she had never had any, who had married for security and now found herself widowed with a fortune that belonged, technically, to her infant daughter. The trust generated income. The income required a guardian to administer it. The guardian, by default, was the child's mother. And Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, at 20 years old, or perhaps 22. The lies about her age had compounded, found herself in possession of approximately $48,000 per year in interest payments. It was her daughter's money. It would fund her daughter's upbringing. It would also fund a great deal more. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt had no intention of remaining in America, surrounded by its memories and its judgments and its Vanderbilt relatives watching her every expenditure, her every move. She had a sister in London, her twin Thelma, who had married a viscount and was rumoured to be involved with the Prince of Wales himself. She had a daughter whose trust fund could pay for virtually anything. She had youth and beauty and, at last, freedom. Within months of the funeral, she was gone. Chapter 3. A Beautiful Stranger. Little Gloria knew hotels better than houses. The Ritz in Paris, Claridge's in London, the Carlton in Cannes. She knew the geography of luxury suites, the sitting rooms where her mother received guests, the bedrooms where she was not permitted, the servants' quarters where Dodo slept on a cot beside her own small bed. She knew the rhythm of her mother's life, the late mornings, the afternoon fittings, the evening departures in clouds of perfume and silk, the silence that followed. Years later, Gloria would describe her mother as a beautiful stranger, glimpsed only fleetingly. The phrase captures everything essential about those early years, the beauty her mother had weaponized into a career, the strangeness of their relationship, the fleeting moments when they happened to occupy the same space. Her mother was always in the next room, at the next party, on the next ship, to somewhere glamorous. She existed as an image perfumed, jeweled, impossibly elegant, rather than as a presence. Gloria worshipped her from a distance, the way one might worship a painting. The only constant was Emma Sullivan Kieslich, the Irish nurse Gloria called Dodo. The nickname's origin has been lost, possibly a childish corruption, possibly short for Big Dodo Elephant, a private joke between them. What matters is that Dodo was the one who bathed her, fed her, held her when she cried, tucked her into unfamiliar beds in unfamiliar cities. Dodo read to her, taught her prayers, explained why Mummy could not come to say goodnight. Dodo was the fixed point in a universe of constant motion. The money that funded this itinerant existence came from Gloria's own trust, approximately $48,000 annually in interest, the equivalent of nearly $900,000 today. Her mother drew upon it freely, itemizing the child's expenses in ways that included hotel suites, couture wardrobes, and first-class passage. The accounting was creative. The oversight was minimal. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt had discovered that her daughter's inheritance made an excellent travel fund. They moved through the great capitals of Europe like a small, strange caravan, the beautiful widow, her twin sister, the silent child, and the devoted nanny. The twins, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt and Thelma Furness, were inseparable. Mirror images who had learned that their beauty was their fortune. Thelma had married well, first to an American shipping heir and then to Viscount Furness, which gave her a title, a country house, an entry into British high society. It also gave her access to the Prince of Wales. By 1929, Thelma Furness had become the Prince's mistress, a position of no official standing, but considerable influence. He was charming, boyish, lonely, within the gilded cage of his birthright. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and discreet. Their affair was an open secret among those who mattered. The prince visited Thelma's country house, Borough Court, near Melton Mowbray, where they rode horses by day and dined with carefully selected guests by night. On January 10, 1931, Thelma hosted a small dinner party at Borough Court, Among the guests was an American woman named Wallis Simpson, recently remarried to a shipping executive. Thelma introduced Wallis to the prince that evening. He would later remember that Mrs. Simpson had a cold that night and was perhaps not at her best congested, sniffling, wrapped in a shawl. It was not an auspicious beginning. But Wallis Simpson had qualities the prince would come to find irresistible: wit, directness, and unwillingness to defer to his station. Their friendship deepened over the following years, carefully managed within the triangular geometry of Thelma's affair. Little Gloria knew nothing of this. Of course, she was 7 years old, concerned with dolls and picture books. But the introduction Thelma made that January evening would reshape history and, in ways no one could have predicted, it would reshape Gloria's life as well. 3 years later, when Thelma sailed to America to support her twin during a custody trial that had captured the world's attention, Wallis Simpson stepped into the void. The prince's affection, once divided, became singular. By the time Thelma returned to England, she found herself replaced. The affair that would lead to the abdication crisis, to a king renouncing his throne, had begun in earnest. The connection is almost too neat an aunt's introduction, leading to a constitutional crisis. A custody trial pulling one woman away at precisely the moment another was waiting. But history often arranges itself in patterns too convenient to be invented. Meanwhile, in America, another aunt was watching, Gertrude Vanderbilt. Whitney was Gloria's great-aunt, the eldest daughter of Cornelius II. She had been born into the same suffocating privilege as her brothers, but she had done something none of them managed. She had built something of her own. Gertrude was a sculptor of genuine talent, a patron of American artists, and the founder of the Whitney Museum of American Art, which opened in Manhattan in 1931. The press called her the richest woman in the world, which captured her standing whether or not it was strictly accurate. She had money, taste, influence, and homes on 3 continents. She also had deep suspicions about her niece-in-law. In the summer of 1932, Gertrude invited 8-year-old Gloria to stay at her Long Island estate, Old Westbury. It was, ostensibly, a vacation, fresh air, horses, cousins to play with. For little Gloria, it was a revelation. Here was a house that stayed in one place, with rooms that remained the same from day to day. Here were gardens and stables and adults who appeared at predictable hours. Here was something she had never experienced in her 8 years of wandering. Here was something that felt, for the first time, like a home. Chapter 4. Weeping and Wailing. On October 1st, 1934, more than 100 reporters crowded into the New York Supreme Court for what the newspapers were already calling the trial of the century. They came with notebooks and cameras, ready to chronicle the custody battle between Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, the glamorous widow, and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the richest woman in America. At stake was a 10-year-old girl and her trust fund. The press treated it as entertainment. The child at its center would be scarred for life. The timing was grotesque. America in 1934 was starving. The national unemployment rate stood at 21% in New York City alone. More than 100 people died of hunger that year, men and women who could not afford bread, while the Vanderbilts fought over which mansion should house their heiress. The newspapers understood the obscenity and printed it anyway. Readers wanted to know about cocktail parties and European lovers, about affairs and German princes. The Depression made the scandal more delicious, not less. The trial would last 7 weeks. It would destroy reputations, shatter families, and leave a child caught between two worlds that neither wanted her for herself. The first surprise was the grandmother, Laura Kilpatrick. Morgan Gloria's maternal grandmother took the stand and testified against her own daughter. She described Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt as an unfit mother, neglectful and dissolute, more interested in parties than in her child. The courtroom stirred. A mother testifying against her daughter was unusual enough. That she did so with apparent relish was remarkable. Gloria would later reflect on her grandmother's role with a mixture of admiration and horror. "I do think she was the one who planned it all very strategically," she told an interviewer decades afterward. "I also think that at times she was very deranged. She absolutely hated men and was very concerned with power. Napoleon was her role model. I absolutely adored her, but her values became more and more cynical. Napoleon as a role model. It explained much about what followed." The nurse came next, Emma Sullivan Keesley. Dodo sat in the witness box for 5 hours, detailing what she had seen in European hotel rooms and English country houses. She described Mrs. Vanderbilt's drinking, her late nights, her neglect of little Gloria. She described visitors to the widow's bedroom. She described books she had found vile books. She called them with illustrations that shocked her. Julia McCarthy of the New York Daily News captured the scene with acid precision. For 5 hours, Mrs. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt listened to a tight-lipped nurse denounce her with virtual relish as a cocktail-crazed dancing mother, a devotee of sex erotica, and the mistress of a German prince. It was a blistering tale no skin lotion could soothe. The German prince in question was Friedel Hohenlohe Langenburg. The accusation was damaging but survivable. What came next was not. A French maid named Maria Caillot took the stand and testified that she had witnessed an intimate scene between Mrs. Vanderbilt and another woman, Nadeda Mountbatten, the Marchioness of Milford Haven. According to the maid, she had entered Mrs. Vanderbilt's bedroom and found the Marchioness there, kissing her just like a lover. The courtroom erupted. Judge John Francis Carew, who had presided over countless cases in his long career, later admitted that until that moment, he thought he had heard everything. The Marchioness of Milford Haven was no ordinary society figure. She was Russian royalty, a great-great-granddaughter of Tsar Nicholas I, a great-granddaughter of the poet Alexander Pushkin. Her lineage connected her to the glittering courts of Imperial Russia, to literature, to history. Before sailing from England to face the accusations, she denounced the maid's testimony as a set of malicious, terrible lies. Judge Carew cleared the courtroom. The press and public were excluded. What followed was heard only by those present and, faintly, by those waiting outside. Decades later, Gloria Vanderbilt herself would confirm that the relationship between her mother and the Marchioness had been real. But by then, everyone who might have been hurt was long dead. The confirmation came too late to matter. The trial's most devastating moment came when the judge summoned little Gloria to his chambers for private testimony. She was 10 years old. She had been coached. Gloria would later reveal that her aunt's lawyer, Frank Crocker, had prepared her in private sessions before the trial. "I went over the lines I'd rehearsed with Crocker again and again," she wrote in her memoir. "I hoped I wouldn't forget anything." Among the fabrications was a story that her mother's German lover had stubbed out a cigarette on her arm, an accusation designed to horrify, with no basis in truth. A 10-year-old girl rehearsing lies to tell a judge about her own mother. It is difficult to imagine a more complete betrayal of childhood. When Gloria entered the judge's chambers, those waiting in the corridor could hear what happened next. They reported hearing weeping and wailing from within the sounds of a child breaking apart under the weight of what she had been asked to do. Whether she wept from trauma or from guilt at the lies she was telling, no record survives. Perhaps both. She was a child, alone with a stranger in a black robe, asked to choose between her mother and her aunt while the world listened at the keyhole. On November 21st, 1934, Judge Carew delivered his verdict. Custody was awarded to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt would be permitted to see her daughter on weekends, for 8 hours on Christmas and July 4th, and during the month of July. The mother who had traveled the world on her daughter's money was now a visitor in her daughter's life. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, shouting. Little Gloria was whisked away to Old Westbury, to the stable life she had briefly glimpsed 2 years earlier. She had won. In a sense, she had gotten what she asked for, or what she had been coached to ask for. But victory brought its own betrayals. Her aunt, having fought so publicly for custody, seemed to lose interest immediately. Gloria would later write that Gertrude Whitney disregarded her new ward completely after the trial. The child who had been the center of a national scandal became, once again, an afterthought. And then there was Dodo. Despite testifying for the Whitney side, despite her devotion to little Gloria, Emma Kieslich was dismissed from service after the trial. The lawyers deemed her a liability too close to the child, too central to the controversy. Gloria's mother's attorneys had argued that Dodo poisoned the child against her. Perhaps the Whitney camp decided there was enough truth in that to make Dodo dangerous. Gloria was 10 years old. She had just testified against her mother. And now the only adult who had truly cared for her was being sent away. Her lawyers said that Dodo had influenced me against her. Gloria wrote years later, and the judge decreed that Dodo could no longer have any contact with me. I was 10 years old, and I thought I would die. The poor little rich girl. The newspapers had given her that phrase during the trial. She would spend the rest of her life trying to escape it. Chapter 5. Escape Velocity. She married for the first time at 17, on December 28, 1941, 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, while the nation was still reeling from the attack that had dragged it into war. The groom was Pasquale Di Chico, a Hollywood agent and sometime actor known as Pat. He was 32 years old, handsome in a sharp-featured way, and connected to people Gloria's family would have preferred she not know. None of that mattered. What mattered was escape. The marriage was a disaster from the start. Di Chico was charming in public and violent in private. Gloria would later describe what happened behind closed doors with the flat precision of someone who had spent decades processing the memory. He would take my head and bang it against the wall. She was a teenager, isolated from her family, married to a man who hurt her. The pattern of her childhood neglect disguised as glamour. Adults who failed to protect her had simply continued in a new form. She endured for nearly 4 years. Then, on the day before her 21st birthday, she filed for divorce. The timing was not coincidental. At 21, Gloria would finally gain control of her inheritance, approximately $4 million from her father's trust and additional funds from her grandmother's estate. For the first time in her life, she would have money that no one else controlled. She would have freedom. The divorce was finalized, and exactly 1 day later, she married again. Leopold Stokowski was 63 years old, one of the most famous conductors in the world. He had led the Philadelphia Orchestra for decades. He had collaborated with Walt Disney on Fantasia. He had silver hair, an aristocratic bearing, and an accent that no one could quite place British, perhaps. or something he had invented. Gloria had known him only briefly by her own account, a matter of weeks before they married. The age gap was 42 years. She was young enough to be his granddaughter. But Stokowski offered something Gloria had never experienced. He took her seriously as an artist. He encouraged her painting, her collages, her creative ambitions. He saw her as more than a name or a scandal or a fortune. For a woman who had spent her whole childhood being fought over like property. This was intoxicating. The marriage produced 2 sons, Leopold Stanislaus, born in August 1950, and Christopher, born in January 1952. But Stokowski's devotion came with conditions. He was controlling, jealous, and preferred that Gloria remain isolated from society. The same attention he lavished on her art became a kind of cage. By 1955, after a decade together, the marriage was over. Her third husband was Sidney Lumet, the film director who would later make 12 Angry Men, Serpico, and Network. They married in August 1956. When Gloria was 32, Lumet was talented, stable, and utterly different from her previous husbands. Their marriage lasted 7 years, long enough to suggest compatibility, short enough to indicate something was missing. They divorced in 1963 without public acrimony. Gloria rarely spoke about him afterward. And then there was Wyatt. Wyatt Emery Cooper was a writer from Mississippi, the son of a farmer, raised in a world as far from Newport mansions as it was possible to imagine. He was handsome, kind, and possessed of a warmth that Gloria had spent her life searching for. They met through mutual friends. They married on December 24, 1963, in Arlington, Virginia. Gloria was 39. Wyatt was 36. For the first time in her life, she had the family she had always wanted. They had 2 sons, Carter, born in January 1965, and Anderson, born in June 1967. Wyatt was a devoted father and a stabilizing presence. He understood Gloria's wounds, her absent mother, her neglectful aunt, her violent first husband, and he loved her anyway. He wrote screenplays and worked on a book about his southern childhood. Their apartment on the Upper East Side became a genuine home, filled with art and books and the ordinary chaos of family life. Gloria would later say that Wyatt gave her something she had never known: safety. Not the cold safety of Whitney wealth, but the warmth of being truly seen. On January 5, 1978, Wyatt Cooper went into surgery for a heart condition. He was 50 years old. The operation was supposed to be routine. It was not. He died on the table, leaving Gloria a widow at 53 with 2 teenage sons and a grief that would never fully heal. She had married at 17 to escape. She had married at 21 for passion. She had married at 32 for stability. And she had married at 39 for love. 4 weddings. 4 different versions of hope. 3 had ended in disappointment or disaster. The 4th had ended in a hospital corridor, with a surgeon delivering news that no amount of money could undo. For the rest of her life, Gloria would ask to be called Mrs. Cooper. The name carried everything she valued: the man she had lost, the family she had built, the love she had finally found after decades of searching. She never married again. She did not need to. She had found what she was looking for. It had simply been taken away from her too soon. She was 53 years old, a widow with 4 sons, and about to reinvent herself once more. Chapter 6. The Jeans Queen. In 1976, Gloria Vanderbilt was 52 years old. Wyatt was still alive, but she could see the future clearly. The inheritance would not last forever. Her sons were children. Carter was 11. Anderson was 9. Her inheritance, spent and regained, and spent again over 5 decades, had dwindled to a fraction of what she had once possessed. She needed to build something of her own. And she needed, perhaps more importantly, to prove something to herself to demonstrate that she was more than a name, more than a scandal, more than a woman who had things happen to her. The opportunity came from an unlikely source, a Hong Kong textile manufacturer named Mohan Murjani, who had made his own fortune producing clothes for other people's labels. Murjani understood something important about the American market that most fashion executives had missed. Women wanted jeans, not the shapeless utilitarian denim their husbands wore, but jeans designed for women's bodies fitted, flattering, fashionable. No one was making them. No designer had thought to try. Gloria became the first to try. The concept was radical for its time. Designer jeans simply did not exist as a category. Denim was workwear, casual, democratic. The idea of putting a famous name on the back pocket, of charging a premium for what had always been cheap and practical, struck many industry observers as absurd. Gloria did not care. She understood something about aspiration that the skeptics did not. People would pay for a name if the name meant something. Her name, after 5 decades of scandal and survival, meant something. The jeans launched with a television commercial that cost $1 million to produce, an enormous sum for the era, more than most companies spent on an entire advertising campaign. Gloria appeared in the ads herself, elegant and confident at 52, demonstrating that glamour had no expiration date. The commercials showed women of different ages wearing the jeans, moving through their lives with the kind of easy sophistication that Gloria embodied. The tagline was simple. The message was unmistakable. These were not just jeans. They were a statement about who you could become. On the very day the first television commercial aired, 150,000 pairs sold. Within 4 years, the Gloria Vanderbilt brand was generating $200 million in annual sales. Her signature, that distinctive, elegant, looping script, was embroidered on every back pocket. A small swan, a symbol referencing her role in the 1954 film The Swan, adorned the front coin pocket. The brand expanded rapidly into dresses, blouses, shoes, handbags, bed linens, and fragrances. By 1980, you could furnish your entire life in Gloria Vanderbilt products if you so chose. The irony was not lost on anyone paying close attention. The Commodore had built his empire on railroads, the infrastructure that connected a nation, the steel and steam that powered the Industrial Revolution. His great-great-granddaughter had built hers on denim. The Vanderbilt fortune, created by a man who openly despised women's capacity for business, was now being rebuilt by a woman who had spent her entire life defying expectations. Gloria spoke about the difference between inherited and earned money with the hard-won clarity of someone who had experienced both extremes. "I'm not knocking inherited money," she told an interviewer in 1985. "But the money I've made has a reality to me that inherited money doesn't have." The inheritance had always felt abstract numbers on paper, controlled by trustees and lawyers and judges, fought over by relatives who saw her as a prize rather than a person. The money from the jeans was entirely different. She had created it. She had earned it. It belonged to her in a way that nothing ever had before. The empire did not last forever. Fashion is fickle, and the designer jeans market that Gloria had helped create soon became crowded with imitators and competitors. Calvin Klein, Jordache, Sasson. Everyone wanted a piece of the market she had pioneered. By the late 1980s, The brand's dominance had faded considerably. Gloria sold the licensing rights to Gitano. The business continued, but she was no longer at its center. There were legal troubles as well. In 1993, a court awarded Gloria $1.7 million in a fraud judgment against former business partners who had cheated her. She never collected a penny of it. The money disappeared into bankruptcy proceedings and legal maneuvering. Another fortune that slipped through her fingers like water. It was a pattern she knew well, wealth appearing and vanishing. The promise of security always just out of reach. But the brand itself survived. It changed hands again when Jones Apparel Group acquired it in 2002 for $138 million. Today, Gloria Vanderbilt jeans are sold at Walmart under the name Amanda Jean. Affordable, accessible, democratic. A far cry from the premium positioning of the original launch. The brand generates over $1 billion in annual retail sales. Gloria's name, that same name she had spent her life trying to escape and then learning to claim, continues to appear on millions of garments worn by women who may never have heard of the custody trial, or the marriages, or the tragedies. She had made more money than she ever inherited. She had proved that she was more than just a name, more than a scandal, more than the poor little rich girl the newspapers had invented when she was 10 years old. She had built something real, something that would outlast her. But success, like everything else in Gloria Vanderbilt's long life, came with a cost, and tragedy was not finished with her yet. Chapter 7. The Terrace. Carter Vanderbilt. Cooper was born on January the 27th, 1965, the third of Gloria's 4 sons, the first child she had with Wyatt. He grew up in the apartment on the Upper East Side, surrounded by his mother's art and his father's books, and the warmth of a family that actually functioned. He was bright, curious, and possessed of the kind of sensitivity that can be both a gift and a burden. He graduated from Princeton. He became an editor at American Heritage magazine. At 23, he was building a life that seemed, by all outward appearances, to be working, but appearances, in the Vanderbilt story, have always been unreliable. In the summer of 1988, Carter was struggling in ways that were not immediately visible. He had recently ended a relationship. He was having trouble sleeping nights of restless anxiety that left him exhausted. He had been prescribed a new asthma medication containing theophylline, a drug that Gloria would later learn had been associated in some cases with psychiatric side effects, anxiety, agitation, and, in rare instances, psychosis. Whether the medication played a role in what followed remains uncertain. Gloria believed it did. It was one of the few explanations she could hold on to. On the evening of July 22, 1988, Carter arrived unexpectedly at his mother's penthouse apartment at 10 Gracie Square in Manhattan. Gloria was home. They talked. At some point, Carter walked out onto the 14th floor terrace. What happened next? Gloria witnessed. Her son climbed onto the terrace wall. She moved toward him, speaking calmly, trying to reach him. For a moment that must have lasted an eternity. He held on. Then he was gone. Gloria was there when her son died. He left no note. He offered no explanation. He was 23 years old. The days that followed were a blur of shock and grief and the terrible logistics that accompany sudden death. There was a funeral. There were condolences from people who meant well but could not possibly understand. There was the impossible task of continuing to exist in a world that no longer contained her child. Gloria had survived the custody trial, the abusive marriage, the loss of Wyatt. She had survived scandal and bankruptcy and the relentless scrutiny that came with her name. But this was different. This was the thing that could not be survived, only endured. Years earlier, Gloria had spoken about the worst moment of her childhood. It was not the trial itself, with its reporters and accusations. It was what came after the loss of Dodo, the Irish nurse who had been the only constant in her young life. "I was 10 years old, and I thought I would die," she had written. Losing Dodo was the worst thing that had ever happened to her, until it wasn't. The worst thing, she would later say, is to lose a child. Nothing else comes close. Gloria kept a Victorian desk calendar by her bed. It was a small, elegant thing with 3 windows displaying the day, the month, and the year. Before July 22nd, 1988, she had changed it daily, the way one does with such objects. After that date, she never changed it again. The calendar remained frozen, July 22nd, 1988, for the rest of her life. For 31 years, she slept beside that fixed point in time, a monument to the moment when everything changed. She wrote about Carter. In 1996, she published A Mother's Story, an attempt to understand what had happened and to honor the son she had lost. The book was painful to write and painful to read. It offered no easy answers, because there were none. Gloria examined the theophylline, the sleeplessness, the breakup, all the fragments that might add up to an explanation. But explanations, she learned, are not the same as understanding, and understanding is not the same as acceptance. When interviewers asked about closure, Gloria's response was sharp and immediate. The most terrible word in the English language. It doesn't exist. The concept offended her, the suggestion that grief could be packaged and completed, that a mother could somehow move past the death of her child. She rejected it utterly. There was no moving past. There was only moving through, carrying the weight of loss every day, learning to live with the calendar that never changed. Her surviving son, Anderson, would later say that the shock of Carter's death remained as painful decades afterward as it had been in the immediate aftermath. Grief, for the Coopers, was not something that faded with time. It was something that became part of them, woven into the fabric of who they were. Gloria and Anderson grew closer in the years after Carter's death. They had always been close. Anderson was the baby of the family, born in 1967, just 2 years after Carter, but the shared loss deepened their bond in ways that only those who have grieved together can understand. They would eventually write a book together. The Rainbow Comes and Goes, published in 2016. It was structured as a correspondence between mother and son, an extended conversation about family, loss, memory, and love. In it, Gloria spoke openly about Carter, about the calendar, about the grief that never diminished. She also spoke about what she had learned from decades of loss. Loss, she came to believe, was not something to be overcome. It was something to be integrated. The people we love who die do not disappear. They become part of us in a different way. Carter was gone, but he was also present in Gloria's art, in her memories, in the frozen calendar by her bed. This was not comfort, exactly. Gloria never pretended it was comfort. But it was truth, and truth was what she had always sought, even when it hurt. The terrace at 10 Gracie Square remained. Gloria continued to live in the apartment for years after Carter's death. She walked past that terrace every day. She did not move. She did not hide from the geography of her grief. She simply lived with it, the way she had lived with everything else, the trial, the marriages, the losses. She endured. Gloria Vanderbilt had learned. over the course of 95 years. That survival is not the same as healing. Some wounds remain open. Some calendars stay frozen. Some griefs become permanent residents in the chambers of the heart. She carried Carter with her until the very end. Chapter 8. The Lost Son. In 1978, the same year that Wyatt Cooper died on the operating table, Gloria Vanderbilt lost another son, not to death, but to silence. Christopher Stokowski, her second child from her marriage to Leopold, was 26 years old when he severed contact with his mother. The reasons remain unclear, tangled in accusations involving a therapist named Christ Zois, whom Gloria had trusted and who, she later alleged, manipulated her son against her. In 1993, a court awarded Gloria $1.5 million in a judgment against Zois, but the money meant nothing. Christopher was gone. He would remain gone for nearly 40 years. The estrangement of a child is a particular kind of grief, not the finality of death, but an ongoing absence, a wound that cannot heal because it is constantly reopened by hope. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone passed without contact becomes a reminder of what has been lost. Gloria had survived the death of Wyatt. She would survive the death of Carter. But Christopher's silence may have been, in some ways, the cruelest loss of all. He was alive somewhere in the world, choosing not to know her. Gloria understood this pain from both sides. She had inflicted it herself. After the custody trial of 1934, Gloria's relationship with her mother had been governed by court order weekends, holidays, the month of July. But when Gloria turned 21 and gained control of her own life, she made a choice. She stopped seeing Gloria Morgan. For 18 years, from 1945 until 1963, mother and daughter had almost no contact. Gloria never explained the estrangement in detail. Anyone who understood the trial, the testimony, the way her mother had spent her trust fund on parties while a nurse raised her, could imagine the reasons. The silence between them was not discussed. It was simply, quietly endured. When Gloria finally reconciled with her mother in her late 30s, it was not through confrontation or resolution. They simply began speaking again, as if the years of silence had been a long pause in a conversation rather than a rupture. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt died on February 13, 1965, in Los Angeles. She was 61 years old. Whatever remained unsaid between mother and daughter would stay unsaid forever. And now Gloria found herself on the other side of that equation. The parallels were impossible to ignore. The custody trial of 1934 had torn Gloria from her mother, first legally and then emotionally. Something the details remain murky had torn Christopher from Gloria. The wounds of that original trial echoed through the generations. The family that had fought over little Gloria continued to fragment, to splinter, to lose pieces of itself to silence. Christopher had attended Bard College. He had shown artistic inclinations, like his mother. He had been part of the blended family, the brothers who grew up in the apartment on the Upper East Side, surrounded by art and books. And then, abruptly, he was not. He became a ghost, present in photographs, absent in life. Gloria rarely spoke about Christopher publicly. The loss was too raw, too unresolved. She had written about Carter's death, had processed that grief through memoirs and interviews and the book she wrote with Anderson. But Christopher's estrangement was different. Death allows for mourning, for ritual, for the slow acceptance that comes with finality. Estrangement offers none of that. It is a loss that renews itself each day. Near the end of Gloria's life, There were reports of partial reconciliation, some contact restored, some bridge rebuilt across the decades of silence. The details remain private, as they should. What matters is that Gloria Vanderbilt lived for nearly 40 years with a son who had chosen to be lost to her. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what that choice meant. She had made it herself. Once. The woman who had been fought over as a child spent her adult life watching her own family fracture along similar lines. The cycle did not end with her. Perhaps it never ends. Perhaps families, like fortunes, are built and lost and sometimes partially rebuilt, generation after generation, each one carrying the wounds of the one before. Gloria Vanderbilt knew what it meant to be cut off from a mother. She knew what it meant to cut a mother off. And she knew, finally, what it meant to be on the receiving end of that same silence, to wait for a phone call that might never come, to wonder if reconciliation was possible, to live with the particular grief of a child who is alive but absent. Some losses cannot be fixed. Some can only be carried. Chapter 9. A Room of Her Own. Gloria Vanderbilt had always been an artist. It was the one constant across 9 decades of upheaval, the one thing that belonged entirely to her, untouched by trustees or ex-husbands or reporters. She had studied at the Art Students League in New York as a young woman, learning technique alongside other aspiring painters who did not know or care about the Vanderbilt name. Her first exhibition came in 1948, when she was 24 and newly married to Stokowski. The reviews were polite, the work was promising, and then life intervened, and art became something she did in the margins of everything else. But it never stopped. Through 4 marriages and countless relocations, through crises and tragedies, Gloria painted. She made collages. She worked in oils and acrylics and mixed media, creating pieces that were deeply personal and often surreal dreamscapes populated by figures from her mythology, images that processed what words could not express. Her art was not therapy, exactly, but it served a similar function, a way of making sense of a life that defied comprehension. In 2001, at the age of 77, Gloria unveiled a new body of work, the Dream Boxes. These were shadow boxes, 3-dimensional assemblages, enclosed in frames, filled with found objects, photographs, fabric, and paint. They were intimate and strange, like glimpses into someone else's subconscious. The exhibition was a surprise success. Critics who had dismissed Gloria as a society figure with pretensions were forced to reconsider. Here was genuine work, produced by a woman who had been quietly developing her craft for half a century. She was 77 years old, and she was just getting started. The Dream Boxes led to more exhibitions, more recognition, a late career flowering that continued into her 90s. In 2014, on the occasion of her 90th birthday, a retrospective was mounted, decades of paintings and collages and boxes, arranged so visitors could trace the evolution of an artist who never stopped growing. Gloria attended the opening, elegant and animated, surrounded by admirers who had watched her reinvent herself. But her creative output extended beyond visual art. Gloria was also a writer, prolific, candid, and determined to control her own narrative before others did it for her. Her first memoir, Once Upon a Time, was published in 1985. It covered her childhood and the custody trial, laying out in her own words the story that had been told about her for 50 years. A mother's story followed in 1996, an attempt to understand Carter, to find meaning in a loss that defied meaning. There were other books, novels, collections, explorations of love and loss. Writing, like painting, was a way of processing. It was a way of saying, this is what happened, and this is how I survived. The most significant collaboration came near the end of her life. In 2016, Gloria and Anderson published The Rainbow Comes and Goes, a book structured as correspondence between mother and son. They had exchanged emails over the course of a year, asking each other questions they had never asked, sharing memories they had never discussed. The result was intimate and unexpectedly moving, a conversation between two people who loved each other and wanted to understand each other more fully before time ran out. The same year, HBO aired Nothing Left Unsaid, a documentary directed by Liz Garbus that covered Gloria's life through archival footage and interviews. Anderson appeared throughout, guiding viewers through his mother's story while processing his own relationship to it. The film was an act of preservation, capturing Gloria while she was still sharp, still funny, still herself, and she was very much herself. At 92, Gloria was on Instagram, posting photographs of her artwork, her apartment, her life. Her followers, many of them young enough to be her great-grandchildren, were charmed by a woman who refused to act her age. Anderson would later observe that despite being 95, his mother was often the youngest person her friends knew. She had retained her curiosity, her appetite for experience, her refusal to be defined by the past. Her philosophy of survival was simple and hard-won. I like the idea of showing that you can go through a lot and still be on your feet, she said. It was not false optimism. Gloria had lost a father before she could know him, a mother who never mothered, a husband who died too young, a son who died too young, another son to decades of silence. She had lost fortunes inherited and earned to bad luck, and the simple mathematics of spending. She had lost her privacy, her anonymity, her right to make mistakes without the world watching, and she was still standing. The work was what remained. The paintings hanging on the walls of her apartment, many unsold because she could not bear to part with them. The books on the shelf, her own rich story told in her own words, the dream boxes, those strange small windows into her interior life, the documentary, the Instagram posts, the final interviews in which she reflected on what she had learned. She had outlived most of her generation. She had outlived scandal and tragedy and heartbreak. What endured was the work, the lasting proof that Gloria Vanderbilt had been here, had created beauty, had made something real that would outlast her. Chapter 10. What Remained. In June of 2019, Gloria Vanderbilt received a diagnosis she had been expecting. Stomach cancer, advanced. There would be no treatment that could save her, only treatment that might extend her time. She was 95 years old. She had outlived almost everyone she had ever loved. When she learned the news, she responded with dark humor. Well, it's like that old song, "Show me the way to get out of this world, because that's where everything is." On June 17, 2019, Gloria Vanderbilt died at her home in Manhattan. Her family was at her side. Anderson announced her death on CNN, his voice steady but his grief evident. "She was 95 years old," he said, "but ask anyone who knew her. She was the youngest person they knew." The obituaries appeared in every newspaper, recounting the trial, the marriages, the genes, the tragedies. They called her an heiress, a designer, an artist. They called her the poor little rich girl. The estate, when it was settled, contained a surprise. For years, tabloids had estimated Gloria's net worth at $200 million, a figure that reflected her famous name more than her finances. The reality was far more modest, approximately $1.5 million. The fashion empire had been sold long ago. The legal judgments had gone uncollected. The fortune that had once exceeded the United States Treasury had, after 5 generations, dwindled to almost nothing. Anderson Cooper inherited what remained. He did not need it. His own net worth, earned through decades of journalism, exceeded $100 million. He had built his career without Vanderbilt money, deliberately. "There's no trust fund," he told an interviewer. "There's none of that. I don't believe in inheriting money. I think it's an initiative sucker." He had watched what inherited wealth did to families: the fighting, the entitlement, the slow corrosion of purpose. But there were things he did inherit, things that could not be measured in dollars. When Anderson went through his mother's belongings after her death, he found what she had left for him to find: his father's eyeglasses, wrapped in white silk ribbon, with a note in Gloria's handwriting, "Daddy's glasses." An Easter egg his brother Carter had painted as a child, preserved for 31 years, and the calendar, that Victorian desk calendar Gloria had kept by her bed since July 1988, frozen on the date her son had died. She had never changed it. Now it belonged to Anderson. She had known he would be the one to go through it all. She had left him breadcrumbs of memory and love. The fortune was gone. The mansions were museums. What remained was what she had chosen to keep: the evidence of the people she had loved, the artifacts of grief she could not release. There was one more detail not found in Gloria's apartment, but connected to her story. When her Aunt Thelma collapsed on a Manhattan street corner in January of 1970, she was carrying in her purse a miniature teddy bear. The Prince of Wales had given it to her 36 years earlier, when she travelled from England to support her twin during the custody trial. Gloria remembered, in her bag was this miniature teddy bear that the Prince of Wales had given her, and it was worn down to the nub. Thelma had carried that bear for 36 years. She had carried it through the loss of the prince to Wallis Simpson, through the abdication crisis, through decades of diminished circumstances. She had never let it go, and when she died, it was still with her, a token of love that had shaped history, worn smooth by time and touch. The Vanderbilts, it seemed, held on to things. They held on to loss. They carried their memories like talismans, unable to release them, unwilling to forget what they had lost. The Commodore's $105 million was gone. The railroads had been sold or bankrupted. The mansions along Fifth Avenue had been demolished, replaced by apartment buildings. Biltmore survived as a tourist attraction. Marble House was a museum. And the Breakers, the 70-room cottage on the cliff above the Atlantic, was now the property of the Preservation Society of Newport County, open to the public for a modest admission fee. Closing. The Breakers opened to visitors on July 1st, 1948, the same summer Gloria Vanderbilt was raising her young sons from her marriage to Stokowski. The same year she held her first exhibition of paintings. The family had leased the house to the Preservation Society for $1 per year, a gesture that acknowledged what everyone already knew: no private family could afford to maintain such a place. The era that built it was over. In 1972, the Preservation Society purchased the house outright for $365,000, a tiny fraction of what it had cost to build, a fraction of what the furnishings alone were worth. A Vanderbilt cousin continued to live on the 3rd floor until her death in 1998, the very last family member to occupy those rooms. After that, the house belonged entirely to history. 400,000 visitors walk through the breakers every year. They come from around the world to see the Great Hall with its 45-foot ceiling, the dining room that seats 34, the music room built in Paris and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. They take photographs. They buy postcards. They try to imagine what it must have been like to live this way, to wake up in rooms faced with marble from Italy and Africa, to dine beneath painted ceilings, to summer in a cottage with 70 rooms. Gloria Vanderbilt was born into that world. She spent 95 years trying to find something it never gave her a home. Not a house. She had lived in dozens of houses, hundreds of hotel rooms, apartments on 3 continents, but a home, a place where she belonged, where she was wanted for herself rather than for her name or her money. She found it briefly with Wyatt Cooper. She found it in the family they built together, and then she lost it, piece by piece, the way she lost everything else. In the library at the Breakers, visitors can see a fireplace that dates to the 16th century. It was imported from the Château d'Arnay-le-Duc in Burgundy. France purchased, disassembled, shipped across the ocean, and reassembled in Newport so that the Vanderbilts could warm themselves before a fire that had once warmed French nobility. Carved into the stone is an inscription in Renaissance French. Translated, it reads, "I laugh at great wealth and never miss it. Nothing but wisdom matters in the end." The people who carved those words 500 years ago are gone. The French nobles who first read them are gone. The Vanderbilts who purchased the fireplace and installed it in their summer cottage are gone. Gloria Vanderbilt, the poor little rich girl who inherited nothing but a name and spent her life trying to make it mean something, is gone. What remains are the stories, the trial that captivated a nation, the marriages that ended in violence or death or silence, the genes that bore her signature, the art she made in the margins of catastrophe, the sons she raised and lost and loved, the calendar frozen on a summer day in 1988. The Breakers stands empty now, filled only with tourists and memories. The fortune is dispersed, the family is scattered, but the name endures on museum placards, on department store labels, in history books that try to explain how one family could rise so high and fall so far. Gloria Vanderbilt survived it all. She survived the trial, the abuse, the bankruptcies, the deaths. She survived being the poor little rich girl. And in the end, she left behind what matters, not money, which disappears, but stories, which remain. Sometimes that is enough.